Kimberly happily drove down the road leading to the farm. Upon arriving at the gate, she honked several times. Her mind was full of questions, and she just wanted to have a calm and relaxing day. She didn't have to wait long, as the young man who took care of the farm soon appeared and opened the gate for her. Scott was responsible for managing the farm and taking care of the stables. A few years ago, Kimberly's grandfather, Mr. Jones, appointed him as an assistant horseman. He learned everything about the farm, and especially how to treat the horses, which were the most precious thing on the property. He never became a very skilled rider, but no one was better than him at taking care of the animals and organizing a farm. Several years had passed since the young men received this vote of confidence from Mr. Jones, and thanks to his work, Scott rose to the position of property manager on his own merits. Kimberly knew very well how much Scott admired and respected her grandfather's legacy. What some people didn't know was that when young Scott lived in an orphanage, he didn't like it there. He managed to make a hole in the yard fence and would escape whenever he felt like it. Sometimes he would walk around the city from sunset to sunrise, begging for money on the streets to eat and even committing petty thefts. Then he would return to the orphanage before they noticed he was gone. It was during one of these escapes that the fates of Howard Jones and young Scott crossed paths in an almost tragic way. This happened about 15 years ago, when Scott was around 10 years old. He saw a girl in the middle of the street, seemingly crossing alone without any adults nearby. Scott noticed a motorcycle coming towards her at a speed that wouldn't allow it to stop in time. The girl was so distracted that she didn't notice the sound of the vehicle coming her way. Using his instincts, young Scott ran towards the little girl and placed himself in front of her, taking the full impact of the motorcycle that threw him to the ground. The girl also fell but wasn't hurt, although she cried from the scare. When Scott came to, his leg was stretched out and his ankle hurt a lot. He thought he had just twisted his foot, but soon realized he couldn't move his leg or put any weight on it to stand up. An older man appeared to check if the girl was okay, and luckily she was unharmed. This man was Howard Jones, and the little girl was Kimberly, his granddaughter. When Mr. Jones noticed that the boy was in a risky situation, he called an ambulance. At the hospital, they discovered that the situation was much more serious than a twisted foot. Scott's leg was broken in 3 different places, and his ankle was in shreds. The doctors did their best to restore the boy's leg, but in the end, he would have a permanent injury. He would limp on that injured leg for the rest of his life. Mr. Jones said that Scott had been a guardian angel for his granddaughter that day. Knowing the severity of the accident, he paid for all the boy's medical care and even made sure to place him in a private ward. 2 weeks after the surgeries, Scott was able to return to the orphanage, now more limited. But Mr. Jones did not abandon him. Feeling indebted to the boy, he visited him a few times and brought Kimberly along. At first, Scott was very reserved, but gradually he became more open. Thus, Howard was able to ask the boy questions and get to know him better. Over time, the man realized how much he liked the boy and decided to become his godfather and legal guardian. Thus, Scott and Kimberly had known each other since childhood. As she got out of the car, Kimberly went straight to talk to Scott. "How is my stallion? Did he miss me?" It had been months since she last visited the stables. Scott assured her that the animal was well and in good shape, as he himself took it for trots in the field several times a week. Kimberly's horse was worth a lot of money. The animal was a gift that Howard Jones had given her shortly after her parents died in a shipwreck. Kimberly was only 16 years old at the time, and the shipwreck had been the biggest shock of her life. After she also became an orphan, the bond between her and Scott grew even stronger. Now she felt the sense of abandonment that the boy had felt for most of his life, without his parents around. Kimberly went to live with her grandfather, who taught her everything about the financial management of a farm. "When I die, you will take care of all this. It's a lot of work, but I'm sure you will manage, and Scott will always help you," he told her when they were together in the big farmhouse. Kimberly received a top-notch education and managed to get into one of the best universities on the East Coast, from which she graduated in economics. It was only 2 years after Kimberly's graduation that Mr. Robert Jones passed away. Despite being broken and having suffered greatly from the loss of her only grandfather, she decided to gather her strength to overcome her grief, taking over her late grandfather's business before the situation became even more complicated. She was so focused on business that her social life became somewhat empty. But Jennifer, her best friend, wanted to change that and started introducing her to various people. One of these people was a very handsome and polite young man named Kevin. Kimberly soon noticed that the man couldn't take his eyes off her and had many qualities. "I think you can find a better boyfriend. He's handsome, but he doesn't seem to want anything serious," Jennifer told her. Kimberly carefully analyzed the young man and found that she had nothing to lose by giving Kevin a chance. At first, they were not dating. They were just getting to know each other better. But the man was charming and impressed her with his knowledge of various things. He knew how to be serious and also knew when to lighten up. It may not have been a whirlwind romance from the start, but Jennifer was certainly pleased to have brought them together. After all, it was clear that Kimberly was becoming more and more in love with Kevin. Kimberly and Kevin's official relationship was short, only a year, and soon after they were engaged. 6 months later, they were at the altar, facing each other. Scott was the only one of Kimberly's friends and guests who did not attend the ceremony. He thought of saying he was too busy with the farm and the horses, but Kimberly owned it all and quickly knew what he was thinking. So Scott said he went for a ride with Kimberly's stallion and mentioned that he had fallen off and hurt his back. The truth is that Scott did not feel part of this world, despite having gained a new life with all the benevolence of the man who became his guardian, and despite how much he liked Kimberly. He still saw himself as a boy who came from the streets, a man who walked with a limp and had no place among the heirs of wealthy families. Even limping, Scott was quick. He ran to his friend and managed to lift her. So many years working on the farm had given the young man enormous strength. Embraced by him, Kimberly was able to be dragged out of the circuit. It was nothing serious. There were no fractures, but a bruise had formed on the woman's hip and thigh. Now she just wanted to go home. So Scott put his friend in his truck and they hit the road. On the way, the woman complained a little about the pain. She talked much more about her husband, who didn't answer his phone or even read her messages. "And when I need him the most, he doesn't answer. How frustrating," she said. "It's a good thing I have you, Scott. I've always been able to count on you," Kimberly said, letting a few tears fall. Scott tried to calm her down, saying everything would be fine. He didn't know what was happening, but he felt that something had disturbed Kimberly. She wouldn't cry just because of the fall. Scott would soon understand perfectly what was bothering his friend. When they arrived in the city, it was already late afternoon. They had to cross the center before heading towards Kimberly's house. How surprised she was to see Kevin's car parked a few meters ahead. She asked Scott to slow down, and he stopped his truck alongside Kevin's luxury car. Kimberly opened her eyes and saw that there was a woman with him. They were kissing passionately. Kimberly was confused, but the worst was yet to come. It wasn't just any woman kissing her husband, but Jennifer, her best friend. Kimberly didn't know whether to cry out of sadness or anger. So this is what had been happening all these months. She wanted to get out and make a scene, but Scott didn't let her. Instead, he said they should wait to see what would happen. After a few minutes, Kevin's car left the place, and they followed it until it reached a hotel. Kimberly felt even worse because it was the hotel she used to frequent with her husband since their dating days. But it had been over a year since he last took her there. Kimberly had never set foot in that place again. But it seemed that Kevin and Jennifer were making good use of the suites. Since Kimberly had frequented the place a lot, she knew a receptionist. She asked her to help by giving her the spare key to the room Kevin was in. The receptionist attended to a customer and didn't know what to do. At first, she said it was impossible to do what Kimberly was asking because she would be fired. But Kimberly pleaded, saying that a receptionist saw that it was her husband in there and that if she helped, she would be very well rewarded. The receptionist wasn't sure if she was doing the right thing, but she handed over the spare key and let the betrayed wife in. Kimberly took a deep breath and opened the door, catching Kevin and Jennifer in the act. Her friend screamed in horror, while Kevin tried to cover himself with the sheets and say he could explain. but Kimberly wasn't in the mood for any explanations. She had already understood everything. "So, this is why you avoid going to the farm, Jennifer, and you disgusting man? You use me as if I were your bank, your treasure, and do this to me? From now on, you have nothing of mine," Kimberly shouted at the two. The two lovers were very scared. Kevin asked her to calm down and not do anything rash. "After all, we are married and can work through this mistake together. You have until tomorrow to disappear from my house," they said. Kimberly left the motel room. Her anger was so great that she even forgot the pain she felt in her hip and thigh when she reunited with Scott. She seemed furious and said she didn't want to go home. After all, Kevin might look for her there, so the two headed back to the farm. On the way, Scott bought anti-inflammatory medications and thermal bags. Kimberly was lamenting everything and needed to vent. In situations like this, she would have talked to Jennifer without thinking twice, but now that was impossible. She had lost her husband and best friend all at once. Upon arriving at the farm that had belonged to her grandfather, the woman was finally able to cry as much as she wanted, without holding back and without caring if anyone saw. Thanks to the painkillers, the pain in her hip wasn't as bothersome. The pain that made her suffer was internal, and no medicine could take it away. Instead of trying to say stupid things or console his friend, Scott just stayed by her side the whole time and let her cry. When she looked deep into his eyes, red from crying so much over a worthless man, Scott finally gathered all the courage he had and said what he had wanted to for years. I love you more than anything," he whispered in her ear. Kimberly stopped crying and kissed Scott. That night, and for the rest of the week, Kimberly stayed at the farm, dealing with the disappointment with Kevin while trying to build a romantic relationship with Scott. After Scott's emotional marriage proposal, Kimberly and he spent the following days in a state of happiness and fulfillment. Finally, they had found love in each other, something that had always been there but took time to be realized. Kimberly couldn't believe that after all the pain and disappointment caused by Kevin, she now had the chance to build a life alongside her best friend, the person she had always been able to count on. She felt grateful and blessed to have this opportunity. In the days that followed, Kimberly and Scott began planning the wedding. They wanted something simple and intimate, just to celebrate their love. Kimberly knew that her grandfather, Mr. Jones, would be happy to see them together. Meanwhile, Kimberly still had to deal with Kevin and Jennifer's betrayal. She wasn't sure how she would proceed with the divorce and the division of assets. But with Scott by her side, she felt strengthened to face this battle. One day, Kimberly decided to confront Kevin personally. She wanted to make it clear that their marriage was over, and that she would not accept any contact or negotiation from him from then on. Kevin, visibly embarrassed, tried to justify himself, but Kimberly didn't want to hear it. She just made it clear that everything that was hers now belonged to her and Scott. In the following months, Kimberly and Scott dedicated themselves to the wedding preparations. They wanted it to be a simple ceremony, but full of meaning, celebrating the love they had finally discovered in each other. Kimberly was happy to see that Scott was increasingly confident and excited about the idea of the wedding. She knew that despite all his insecurities, he had always loved her deeply. Now, they had the chance to live that love freely. During this period, Kimberly also took care of the divorce proceedings with Kevin. Although it was a delicate situation, she remained firm and determined. She knew she needed to free herself from that marriage to move forward with Scott. Finally, the long-awaited day arrived. Kimberly and Scott got married in an intimate ceremony at the farm they loved so much. Their closest friends and Mr. Jones, in spirit, were present to celebrate the union of the two. Kimberly felt relieved and emotional. It was an achievement not just for Scott, but for both of them. They had overcome so many obstacles together and were now ready to build an even more promising future. Kimberly felt grateful for having found her happy ending alongside Scott. Together, they would face any challenges that arose, strengthened. After this conversation, Kimberly felt relieved. She knew there would still be many challenges ahead, but with Scott by her side, she felt ready to face them. Together, they would build a new future, far from the lies and betrayals of the past. It was one day that week that Kimberly revealed to Scott that she had found a ship specialized in a type of surgery that could heal his leg injury. She said she had already confirmed it, but they believed he was the right person to perform the procedure. Scott was moved by Kimberly's initiative, but said the surgery could wait. First, he wanted to do something. Then, Scott took out a small box containing 2 rings that Mr. Howard Jones had left for him. "I have always loved you deeply. Will you marry me?" Scott whispered in Kimberly's ear, presenting the rings that had belonged to his grandparents. Kimberly couldn't say anything. She responded with actions, giving him the warmest hug and the most passionate kiss of her life. Now she finally saw that Scott had always been the man of her life. After so much suffering and disappointment, Kimberly found true love in the arms of her best friend and lifelong companion, Scott. Together, they would build a life full of happiness and companionship on the farm they loved so much. And so, the story of Kimberly and Scott, which began with an act of heroism and solidarity so many years ago, reached its happy ending, uniting 2 hearts that were destined to be together forever.